Wilbur Wright turned down investment from the world's wealthiest person. A case study of historic entrepreneur Wilbur Wright. September 18th, 1901, Dayton, Ohio. It was a crisp and sunny morning as Wilbur Wright departed his hometown on the early train to Chicago. He was proud to be from Dayton. It had become a bustling, growing city with streetcars, shops, and factories. The population was growing with immigrants from a mix of countries as well as rural folks moving to town to find their opportunities. As the train picked up speed, he could see the many black drapes and vestments hanging from buildings, balconies, and poles. The city, and the nation, mourned the death of President William McKinley, who'd been shot by an insane anarchist while attending the Pan American Exposition at Buffalo, New York. McKinley had been Ohio's own, a Civil War hero, former congressman, and governor, and now the third president to fall at the hands of an assassin. He and his brother Orville had opened their bicycle business here in 1892. They had thought that they could build a profitable business manufacturing and selling bicycles. That had indeed ended up being the case. At the time they'd started building bicycles, Wilbur had thought they were on the advanced edge of building a sophisticated machine. He couldn't help but chuckle at the thought when he compared bicycles to what they were working on now, or trying to work on anyway. Wilbur was 4 years older than his brother, now 34 to Orville's 30. Where had time gone? While the people of Dayton had found their bicycle business interesting when they opened it 9 years earlier, he knew many people didn't really give it much of a chance to succeed. Who would want to ride a bicycle after all? And most businesses tend to fail. Wilbur smiled at that reflection too. The Dayton gossips ended up being wrong about their bicycle business. Thank God. God also needed to be thanked because the bicycle business was prosperous enough to fund the project that had filled much of Orville and Wilbur's time for the last 3 years. If people thought a bicycle business was a risky affair, how about building a self-propelled flying machine? Businesses often fail, but inventors almost always do. At least those working on inventing flying machines. Through books, he'd steeped himself in the long history of man's attempts to fly. None of those attempts had ever worked. Not one. Their work had started in earnest 3 years ago, after he'd consumed all the books written on flight. Their aim had always been to build a self-propelled flying machine, but they'd broken it down into smaller projects to solve a limited number of problems at one time. The first, naturally enough for owners of a bicycle business, was balance. If you get something into the air, how do you keep it there? He'd studied birds for inspiration. The buzzard has wings with a dihedral angle, like the letter V, and has difficulty maintaining equilibrium in strong winds and needs to flap its wings for steadiness. A flapping machine didn't seem like a good idea or even mechanically feasible. Eagles and hawks, by contrast, held their wings level. They rise faster than the buzzard and have steadier motion. They use less energy to maintain balance and are better soarers than buzzards. So, what they'd first built was like a kite with a shape inspired by the soaring birds. A glider, he supposed. Their first version 3 years ago consisted of 2 fixed wings, one above the other. Each wing was 5 feet wide by 17 feet long. They'd made some progress on wing size and shape, but the challenge they had yet to make much progress on was controls. Once the glider is in the air, how does an operator control it with any level of precision? It was the same as a bicycle. Once you could balance and move forward, how do you adjust speed, turn, and brake without crashing to the ground? Falling from a bicycle is one thing. A fall from a flying machine is quite another. The first glider they designed had weighed slightly less than 50 pounds, with its bones made of lightweight wood and its skin fabric that they had sewn. With he or Orville aboard it, it totaled about 190 pounds. He remembered their first success from 1 year ago, October 1900, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. He was lying flat on his stomach, head first, in the middle of the lower wing. A wind of at least 30 miles per hour was in his face. The glider was secured by ropes to 2 posts, tied to each side of the lower wing. At Orville's command, he'd move the levers, and the glider began to rise. His view looking forward changed from looking across the sand dunes before him to looking down on them. He worked very clumsily to maintain fore and aft balance by means of the forward rudder. He'd learned that the difficulty wasn't getting the glider up when a strong wind blew, which it did most days at Kitty Hawk. Rather, it was how to keep it down. In those first experiments, they'd try to master controlling it at a level of 20 feet off the ground or thereabouts. A wind of about 20 miles per hour was ideal, but the pull of a machine upward could be fierce when the wind was stronger than this, which at Kitty Hawk it often was. Many times, both he and Orville as operators had pulled too strongly on the controls as the glider tilted upward. What goes up must come down, and coming down too rapidly meant frequent repairs were needed. Overall, their first round of experiments with the glider had generally been successful, or at least they'd learned a lot and took what they perceived as positive steps toward development of a flying machine. Wilbur thought of the second round of experiments with less pride. Was there any positive progress? No, he thought. Their second glider, supposed to be better than the first, ended up being worse. They'd returned to Kitty Hawk's 4 months earlier, July 1901, to test their second glider. They'd integrated changes to wing shape and size based on calculations from some of the most prominent scientists working on the issue. He remembered needing to use full power of the rudder just to keep the glider from plowing into the ground or rising so high so as to lose headway. Something had been radically wrong. On one glide, the machine even began to drift backward. The adjustments of the machine they'd made were off. The curvature or camber of the wings from the leading edges to the rear was too great. What was so troubling was that the ratio they had gone by was exactly what Otto Lilienthal had recommended, about 1 to 12, whereas for their glider the year before, machine number 1, the brothers had used a ratio of 1 to 22. Lilienthal was a pioneering German aviator and engineer. He was one of the first people to make successful controlled flights with gliders, though he died in a glider experiment 5 years earlier. He was starting to understand why the Germans' glider and the calculations used to design it were flawed, fatally so for Lilienthal. They had tried to make further adjustments to the machine at Kitty Hawk, but by the first part of August decided to end the round of experiments and return to Ohio. He hadn't expected the second version of the machine to be perfect, of course, but neither had he expected it to be worse than their first try. He knew that designing a machine no one else had figured out would be the most challenging thing he'd ever done, but it now felt like he would have to live to be 200 years old to successfully invent a self-propelled flying machine. The train had to be moving at near 60 miles per hour by now. He watched the open country speed by. Fields of corn nearing harvest, interspersed with farmyards, blurred in the distance. Would he ever be able to experience moving at the same speed, but look down from above? Would any man fly in the next 1,000 years? He was traveling to Chicago at the invitation of Octave Chanute, another pioneer in aviation. Chanute had written a book published in 1894 entitled Progress in Flying Machines that Wilbur had consumed as part of his readings on the subject. Chanute was a bridge-building engineer by profession, but his enthusiasm about flight had connected the two of them. The invitation was for Wilbur to address the Western Society of Engineers in Chicago on the subject of their gliding experiments. It was the first time anyone had requested him to speak in public, and he had been extremely reluctant to accept. But his sister, Catherine, had nagged him into going. That he might prove a poor speaker never had entered Catherine's thoughts, though it certainly was part of his own. Later the same day, Chicago, Illinois. Arriving in Chicago, he was struck, as always, by the bustle. There were just so many people. On the streets near the train station, there were vendors selling food and goods, and newsboys shouting the latest headlines to sell their newspapers. He'd caught a streetcar and went directly to Chanute's 3-story brownstone on Huron Street. He was to dine with Chanute prior to his 8 p.m. speech. He was relieved to find his hosts as cordial as ever. Chanute had a distinguished appearance with a well-groomed mustache and always wore a suit, waistcoat, and a bow tie. Wilbur guessed Chanute to be about 70 years old, but his entire expression was of someone decades younger, very curious, thoughtful, and energetic. They were now seated in Chanute's third-floor private study, which was chock full of models of flying machines and taxidermied birds. Will you give me an advance preview of your talk, Wilbur? Asked Chanute. The French accent remained for the man who'd immigrated decades earlier. Did you give it a title? He had his notes from the speech in his hands. Yes, Octave, he replied. Some Aeronautical Experiments is the title. I think your work qualifies as more than just experiments, Wilbur, but your modesty is consistent, said Chanute. I do hope you will share the technical details. The audience will be receptive. I'll obey your request, Octave, he replied. The center of the talk is the theme of our work. What's needed above all for success with the flying machine is the ability to ride with the wind. How can we create controls for a machine that will balance and steer in the air, when the air changes character every second through wind pressure and other things? He rose from the chair and took the top sheet of his notes to illustrate. He held the sheet of paper parallel to the floor and then let it drop. He watched the paper make its way toward the floor in an unsteady, contravening path. You see, Octave, the paper does not settle steadily towards the floor in a staid, sensible, and predictable way. It insists on breaking every recognized rule of decorum, turning over and darting hither and thither in the most erratic manner, much after the style of an untrained horse. He picked up the sheet of paper from the floor and sat back down. A flying machine will be developed in one of two ways. One is to work out theories of it on paper, then try those theories in a machine. The second, and our way so far, has been to learn by actual practice of building and trying to fly a machine. We've mounted a machine and become acquainted with its tricks by actual trial. Indeed you have, exclaimed Chanute, braver than me. For the many people who've died trying their flying machines, I don't know if bravery is the right word. Perhaps stupidity is more accurate. The progress you have made, Wilbur, seems to me far from stupid. I have to admit, though, Octave, that coming back from Kitty Hawk 2 months ago, I didn't think we'd made any progress from our first glider there. But I think we've begun some work in Dayton that's a third way, a new way, a means of testing designs, but also carefully making measurements that enable us to understand the mathematics of flying. Chanute slapped his knee. What is the means of this testing? Will you keep me in suspense? Wilbur smiled at his host. I won't share it tonight with the audience, but I did hope to get your perspective. He pulled another piece of paper from his journal. Here's the drawing of a wind tunnel we've built. Let me explain. January 1902, Dayton, Ohio. Their bicycle shop was in a building on 3rd Avenue. It was a 2-story brick structure with tall windows across the front displaying several bicycles for sale. A sign above the windows read, Wright Bicycle Co. They'd added a frame addition to the back of the building, which is where they had assembled their flying machines, but their work recently was on the 2nd floor. He and Orville had just greeted a visitor, Octave Chanute. Wilbur took Chanute's coat and hung it from a peg on the wall. I hope your train journey was pleasant, Octave. Is this your first time visiting Dayton? Indeed, it is, he replied. He looked at Wilbur's brother who had just walked up the stair. And you must be Orville, the other half of the flying machine dynamo. Orville smiled. If we add to 100%, I'm afraid I'm much under 50%. He was a bit shorter and sturdier than his older brother, with darker hair and a mustache. If less studious than Wilbur, he made up for it in energy and enthusiasm. Wilbur shared his correspondence with you. Your encouragement and shared insights have been so helpful. After Wilbur returned from Dayton from giving his speech in Chicago, his correspondence with Chanute had become almost constant. Wilbur had written Chanute nearly once per week, with some of the letters close to 10 pages in length. Chanute invariably replied without delay. Chanute turned to the machine in the center of the room and walked toward it. So this is the wind tunnel. I've so much enjoyed your letters explaining it, but simply needed to see it for myself. I'm afraid my letters have been so long and so detailed that they must bore you, Octave. No, he gushed. It is my naive replies that are probably too long. My sense is that the torch has passed, Wilbur. You are now the teacher. I am the student. Wilbur smiled at that as he stepped toward the machine. I don't know if I'm the teacher, but I'm a better student now. The wind tunnel has helped create much more rapid learning. The wind tunnel was a wooden box, 6 feet long, 16 inches square, standing on 4 legs about waist high to them. One end was open and a fan mounted at the other. The fan was powered by a gasoline engine that sat beside it. Wilbur leaned over the open end of the box. For the testing apparatus inside the box, we've used old hacksaw blades. We cut them to different sizes and hammer them into a variety of shapes and thicknesses, some flat, some concave, some complex, some square or oblong. We string them on bicycle spoke wires so that they're suspended in the middle of the tunnel. The letter you wrote me last week described your 12th experimental design, commented Chanute. How many more have you run in the last week? None, I'm afraid, Wilbur said. I've been pressed with bicycle business. It's my fault, Octave commented Orville. The bicycle business is seasonal in nature. We sell few in the winter months, but we need to use this time to build models we hope to sell in the warmer season. Wilbur's essential to these wind tunnel experiments, but he's also essential for us to build the number of bicycles necessary to fund our continued work on a flying machine. Chanute laughed. I am at the stage of life where I have the time and money to spend at my own discretion, but I do remember when I had to work to earn my bread and my board. He looked into the wind tunnel. Even with your time constraints, it is perfectly marvelous to me how quickly you get results with this machine. It equips you to test the endless variety of curved surfaces more than rapidly than anybody has ever contemplated. Wilbur ran his hand over the box. Though it doesn't look like much, it's proven to be of immense value. We're able to test many wing surfaces, setting the different shaped hacksaw blades at angles from 0 to 45 degrees and winds up to 27 miles an hour. It can seem like a slow, tedious process, but these metal models will tell us how to build our next glider. Compared to redesigning the gliders at Kitty Hawk, this is much more rapid. Chanute moved towards a chair and a side table at the side of the room. What if I could help you even more rapidly? Wilbur shook his head. Octave, if this is another offer of money, please understand that I value your expertise and friendship much more than your money. You're one of the most generous spirits I've ever known. I've a new idea. Sit down. Hear me out. He pointed to Wilbur and Orville to sit at the circular table. My funds are small, but I've been corresponding with someone with much greater capacity about your work. Your circle of correspondence is impressive, Octave, Wilbur commented. What and whom do you have in mind? Andrew Carnegie, replied Chanute. I met him a few times while in New York City. Wilbur, he read some of the press articles about your September speech in Chicago, and he wrote to me. Orville rapped his knuckles on the table. Will, how about that? Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America. Heck, the richest man in the world. He's noticed our work. Carnegie was the Scottish-American industrialist who built a steel manufacturing empire. His business, Carnegie Steel, was the largest in the United States. The prior year, he'd garnered plenty of headlines himself when he'd sold the business to J.P. Morgan for close to $500 million. Now Carnegie was on a high-profile mission to give most of the money away, starting a campaign of building libraries and other civic structures around the country. Why is somebody like Carnegie interested, Octave asked Wilbur. Someone like him has no worries. He has no worries, Wilbur, that's true enough. But it seems he still has curiosity. His core questions are about the feasibility of your flying machine and your trajectory. Will the Wright brothers be successful, was his inquiry. Orville was still smiling. And what was your reply? I wrote him that I thought you would have a self-propelled flying machine within 2 years. 2 years, exclaimed Orville. How about that, Will? Will had his head in his hands. 2 years. Highly unlikely. Brothers could be so differently tempered. He grabbed a publication from the table. Did you see the article written by George Melville? He's the chief engineer of the U.S. Navy and an admiral. He denounced the entire idea of a flying machine as a total sham. Opening the North American Review, he picked out a few sentences and quoted the article. A calm survey of a certain natural phenomenon leads the engineer to pronounce all confident prophecies for future success as wholly unwarranted, if not absurd. Where, even in this hour, are we to look for the germ of the successful flying machine? Where is the preparation today? Carnegie knows of these skeptics, assured Chanute. I imagine that he met skeptics in his steel business over the decades too. He understands that the right imagination from the right people can overcome all difficulties. So what's your idea, Octave asked Orville. $10,000, he replied. I believe he's interested enough in your work to become a financial partner. That money can enable you to focus all your time on your experiments, not on bicycles. $10,000, Will, said Orville. We can definitely get a machine in the air in the next 2 years if we work at it full bore. What do you say? He's Scottish, smirked Wilbur. He's probably too hard-headed to get involved in something so risky. I appreciate your support, Octave. I really do. But let's leave Mr. Carnegie out of it. Are you afraid he'll say no? Asked Orville. He liked to be the provocateur. No, said Wilbur. The opposite. I'm afraid there's a chance he'll say yes. When Wilbur Wright turned down investment from Andrew Carnegie. We know that in late 1901, Octave Chanute did, in a letter to Wilbur Wright, offer to write Andrew Carnegie about investing in the Wright brothers' self-propelled airplane development experiments. We also know that Wilbur Wright graciously wrote back Chanute, turning down that offer. Andrew Carnegie had sold his steel business, Carnegie Steel Company, to J.B. Morgan in 1901. The sale was part of a deal to create what became United States Steel Corporation, which was the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Carnegie's company was sold for about $480 million, which was an enormous sum at the turn of the 20th century. Adjusted for inflation, this amount would be close to $150 billion today. The sale effectively made Carnegie the richest man in the world at that time and allowed him to focus on philanthropy for the remainder of his life. As an aside, Andrew Carnegie believed in the power of books and access to knowledge, and he put significant funds into the building of public libraries. Think of public libraries as the internet of that era. A Carnegie library was built in my town, Ames, Iowa, with a $10,000 grant in 1903 and 1904, and that original structure is still a part of the Ames Public Library building today. 2,509 Carnegie libraries were built between 1883 and 1929. Wilbur and Orville Wright funded 100% of their work to develop the airplane using money they'd made from their bicycle business. While not a huge business, it was enough to support them, a mechanic that ably ran the bicycle business in their absence, and their years of experiments. By one estimate, the Wright brothers' total expenditure on development of the flying machine up to the first powered flight in 1903 was $1,300. That's about $365,000 in today's money. It's remarkable that they spent less than the average cost of a home to create the most sophisticated machine in history to that point in time. Development of the wind tunnel for rapid experimentation was a key moment in their journey. By January 1902, the Wrights understood that they had turned an important corner. They could more rapidly iterate on wing shape and begin to develop precise mathematical ideas about what today we call aerodynamics. Chanute noted the difference in Wilbur Wright before the experiments and after, describing him as having transformed from a tinkerer to a creative and confident scientist. Quentin Wald, an aerospace engineer whose father worked for the Wrights at their business, wrote an excellent book about the importance of their work entitled The Wright Brothers as Engineers, an appraisal and flying with the Wright brothers, one man's experience. He notes in the book that until a few decades ago, the perception was that the Wright brothers were a couple of Midwestern bicycle builders who managed to build a box-like machine that actually flew, thereby initiating the development of aviation. In recent decades, however, following subsequent engineering studies of their efforts, it became apparent that they were superb investigators of the problems of designing a flying machine, and that they researched the problems and solved them logically and sequentially as needed in building and flying their machines. He noted that their wind tunnel experiments, as well as in propeller design, showed them to be ingenious experimenters and theoreticians. A wind tunnel had been used by an English experimenter as early as the 1870s, and by several others prior to the Wright brothers. But none of those prior inventors achieved anything close to the Wrights, who worked independently and in their own way. The bicycle business did keep Wilbur and Orville from translating what they learned with their wind tunnel experiments until the next summer. But by August 1902, they had finished building the next version of their glider. They returned to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in October 1902, and by month's end, they had developed a movable rear rudder that enabled much better control of the machine. They knew that they had a plane that could fly if only they could develop an engine to propel it. You'll be able to read a case study about that project, development of what became the first aluminum block internal combustion engine, in my forthcoming book, The Entrepreneur's Ethic. First in flight. The culmination of the Wright brothers' years of work occurred on December 17, 1903, on the Outer Banks of North Carolina at Kitty Hawk. The Wrights had befriended many locals as this was their fourth fall spent at Kitty Hawk, but a cold wind blew that day and only 5 others showed up to watch. The 600-pound flyer was pulled about a quarter mile to the 60-foot launching track. The engine started with a roar. The Wrights had flipped a coin to determine whose turn it was to fly, and it was now Orville's turn. He lay on his belly between the 2 propellers and the many truss wires. His hips were nestled in a paddle cradle, and he could control the wing warping wires by shifting his body from side to side. He held his head up to see forward past the horizontal rudder that controlled the up or down pitch of the flyer. One of the locals present who had assisted the Wrights had confidence in what he was about to see. "We had seen the glider fly without an engine," remembered John T. Daniels, "and when those boys put an engine in it, we knew they knew exactly what they were doing." The brothers exchanged glances. Orville released the rope restraining the flyer and had headed forward slowly against a strong headwind. Wilbur ran alongside with his hand on the wing, the flyer going slow enough that he could keep up. At the end of the short track, the flyer lifted into the air. Daniel's job for the day was to operate the camera the Wrights had purchased to document the progress and the problems. He'd never operated a camera before, but he pushed the button at the right moment to take what would be one of the most historic photographs of the century. The flyer rose, dipped down, rose again, bounced, and dipped again like a bucking bronco when one wing struck the sand. The distance flown had been 120 feet, less than half the length of a football field. The total time airborne was approximately 12 seconds. The moment had come for Orville and Wilbur Wright. First in flight. On that cold December morning in 1903, they would take 3 more successful flights. Wilbur would stay aloft the longest that day, with a flight of nearly 1/2 mile lasting 59 seconds. 4 years of work culminated in something people had dreamed about for a very long time. It had taken 4 years of almost nonstop argument and accidents, building and breaking, making and mistaking, toil and tinkering, zigging and zagging. But they were here, flying. Not very high, not very far, but flying. The Wrights had a sense of what it meant for them in the world. For the first time, a man operated a machine that took off from the ground using its own power, flew forward at a steady speed, and landed safely at a point as high as where it had started. The world would not be the same after this historic day. The flyer that proved so much that December day in 1903 is not, from a technical or materials perspective, very close to the commercial jets you fly on today. The Wrights knew that there was so much more that was needed to be learned before flight could become a regular feature of human existence. Indeed, the flyer from that day would be boxed up and never be flown again. But the elements that were combined in the correct ways by the Wrights are still there today. Wing shape, horizontal and vertical rudders or flaps, propellers or jets. What that flight in 1903 had done more than anything was turn sparks of human imagination into an inferno. What many had thought impossible was possible. And not just scientists, engineers, and professors. Anyone who in the subsequent years read a newspaper or magazine article about a self-propelled airplane now likely had a notion that the future was bent at a different angle from the past. We would now be part of the heavens. Ethic 3, fail successfully. The Wright brothers' work on the airplane exemplifies Ethic 3, fail successfully. This is the experiment orientation of entrepreneurship. No one craves failures. The Wright brothers certainly didn't. But what they knew is that most of what they tried would not work the first time. Often it also didn't the second, third, fourth, or 14th time. But they managed their failures effectively in the 1900 to 1903 period. They understood that the best learning occurs in failures. So, keep those failures survivable. Survivable physically. What goes up will come down. Survivable emotionally. That glass is half full. Survivable financially. Broke machine, but not broke bank account. I knew about the Wright brothers more in legend than in details, but then some years ago I read David McCullough's wonderful book, The Wright Brothers. What struck me then, and still today, is how much the story of their development of the first self-propelled airplane mirrored more modern successful startup business stories. Make mistakes fast, learn, try again. They broke the project into separate parts and attacked each of those parts in a unique way, but with the same underlying ethos. Go into it knowing that even with the most careful of preparation and research, trying to build new things will not work right the first time. So be flexible and observant while iterating. Theory does not come before tinkering, though that is often the perception. The widely held belief is that scientists, professors, and professional theoreticians conceive ideas that are then implemented by inventors, designers, and entrepreneurs. Nope, it's the other way around. Tinkering first, theorizing second. How did the Wrights react to their failures of 1901? They decided to figure things out by themselves. The first real working wind tunnel in the United States was not at a university, government institute, or a science lab. It was in the garage of two bicycle entrepreneurs in Dayton, Ohio. Using the wind tunnel, the Wrights could quickly learn and do so with little risk. Aviation history is littered with the unfortunate stories of dead would-be inventors. What goes up must come down. And the Wright brothers had experienced crashes before that historic day in December 1903 flight and more thereafter, but they were not unmitigated risk takers. As an example, why Kitty Hawk, North Carolina? The Wrights spent considerable time determining where to conduct their flying machine tests. They certainly would have preferred to have done it in Dayton, Ohio, but there weren't the consistent and steady winds they wanted for testing. It turns out that the Outer Banks of North Carolina have some of the most consistently available 20 to 30 mile per hour winds of any place in the continental United States. And it took a lot more work in those days to figure that out than a Google search would today. What else did Kitty Hawk have? Soft landings. It was a barren landscape, but one that was mostly sand. With the ever-present winds from the Atlantic Ocean, the Wrights could test their gliders and then the flyer on almost a daily basis. But it was crash and learn, not crash and burn. Forging order from chaos by failing successfully involves a key tactic used by the Wrights and by successful entrepreneurs through time. When something doesn't work or goes wrong, entrepreneurs ask what, not who. When the Wrights looked at the wreckage of their glider, they asked questions that create learning, not blame. What was it about that gust of wind that caused the wreck? What about wing design might allow for more stable flight in the face of turbulence? What alternative design for the rudder will enable better operator control in stormy winds? Bureaucrats, politickers, and hangers-on take credit for that they did not create and blame others for the things they did create that did not work. Entrepreneurs own mistakes, learn, and move on to what comes next. In the speech he gave in Chicago in September 1901, Wilbur Wright summed up their approach. If one were looking for perfect safety, he said, one would do well to sit on the fence and watch the birds. Quote, but if you really wish to learn, you must mount a machine and become acquainted with its tricks by actual trial. End quote. North Carolina license plates read, First in Flight, while Ohio license plates wear the slogan, Birthplace of Aviation. And there's the University of Dayton Flyers. As with most historic inventions and events, there is plenty of credit to be claimed. The Wright brothers gained the fame they desired for being first in flight, though they also publicly acknowledged the insights and help they'd received from others, including Octave Chanute. Creation of the flyer didn't occur in a vacuum, and there was much else happening in experimental flights at the same time, certainly in the United States, but in other countries as well, such as France and Brazil. The Wrights ultimately proved more adept at aviation than business management, and went on to get caught up in a complex series of patent lawsuits in the decade following their first flight. Still, they did well financially, and the industry attracted huge numbers of other inventors and entrepreneurs that would take what the Wrights had started and ultimately surpass what their own business accomplished. Wilbur wrote to a friend in France about the patent lawsuits. He wrote, "When we think of what we might have accomplished if we'd been able to devote this time to experiments, we feel very sad. But it is always easier to deal with things than with men, and no one can direct his life entirely as he would choose." Easier to deal with things rather than men, indeed. It appears to this reader of their history that the Wrights' priority was much less about money than about denting the universe by demonstrating first that a self-propelled flying machine was possible, and they accomplished just that. If you get a chance to visit the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., you can look at their 1903 flyer and consider what you can learn from their example. Creating and building new things is rarely, if ever, going to work right or as expected. Lean into the chaos of creating the new and draw lessons from mistakes and problems. But learn how to limit the downside, physically, financially, emotionally, reputationally. Inject order into the chaos. And most of all, know that failure is part of the process. Create learning from failures, and small mistakes will become great accomplishments. Ethic 3: fail successfully.